Good morning, everybody. Who here likes math? Awesome, okay. A few people. I ask that question a lot of times. So I teach a couple of research classes and stats classes in the past. And I think that people tend to go into human services or social services because they're good with people, you know, and they don't necessarily gravitate towards the right brain activity of calculations and mathematics. But if you're feeling comfortable with it, then hopefully there'll be some tips and some tools here today that you find useful. And even if you are uncomfortable with it, I hope I can present some relatively straightforward ways to think about some statistics and answer some questions, things that will help you show others the effect that your agency has with the populations that you serve. Of course, this follows up on many things, including the measurement aspect of the last training, which I'm going to kind of just dip back into where we've been and kind of lay out the roadmap to how we got to where we are today, because I don't want to just throw everybody in the middle of this. So this is the third module. My agenda today is to discuss some strategies for data management, so thinking about how you manage data at the agency level, and then even some simplistic strategies, straightforward strategies to look at reporting some of that information, what you do with it after you have it. We collect a lot of data in social service and education agencies, and sometimes we don't use it to drive policy or decision making. So how do we do that? I'm going to briefly give an overview and review. Then we're going to talk about managing and preparing data, how you get it into a data set or a spreadsheet, look at some strategies for analysis, and look at some strategies for reporting those results. So quick overview and review. Our three modules all together. Really the what of program evaluation is where we started at, looking at the logic model, making it the backbone of describing a program and the backbone of a grant application. Module 2 really looked at the how of program evaluation. So how do we identify metrics and ways of measuring the concepts that we're interested in targeting? These things are connected directly or informed directly by our logic model in terms of what those outcomes are, and I'll go over that in a brief moment. And then today's module, analyzing that data once we had it. So module 1 looked at the logic model. Ultimately, I did see an improvement in folks that attended that day in terms of their ability to correctly identify the logic model components at post-test. There are some limitations of this data. For one, I didn't have the identification numbers attached, as I do on your pre-test and your post-test for today. So there's like 5 questions, basic questions on data analysis in that packet that you have. When you get a moment, please, before we get into some of that material, take a moment to just look at those items and try to answer them to the best of your ability. And then at the close of it, it would be very helpful if you'd answer the post-test as well. And there's a few individual items that kind of help me with, I do a lot of trainings like this, and give me a little feedback on what works for you and what doesn't. So I'd appreciate any feedback you'd give me. So the logic model briefly looks like spaghetti kind of, doesn't it? The core components, however, the inputs, which are really the resources that are required to run our agency or our program, the activities, what we're going to do with those resources. These are the actual actions that we are intending to implement in order to change or alter the state of what it is that we want to intervene with. The outputs is really just a countable product of those activities, how many lessons are taught, how many trainings we had, and then the outcomes is really where the story is. And this is where funders really want to hear what it is, you know, the data you've collected and how you analyze it and report it. But what I think is important for agencies in terms of, you know, my perspective from working in education is really about using some of that information for process. How can I improve what it is that we're doing in-house? How can I improve the service delivery to students or to my clientele? So I think that is the piece of the logic model and of evaluation that often gets left out. We're always interested in what the real story is. What's the impact? What's the outcome? But I think that in order to really improve that outcome, in order to get to where it is that we want to be, we have to make sure we pay attention to the process as well. When we do talk about outcomes, typically funders talk about them in a developmental sequence from short-term, interim, or long-term, also called proximal, medial, distal, immediate, intermediate, The United Way was one of the first human service organizations, at least not tax funded anyway, to really think about funding programs and looking at outcomes in a developmental fashion. And they use the term impact, which is the model that is attempting to be implemented here in Columbia. It's a process, not a product. We'll get there. But really, we're looking at immediate changes in knowledge or attitudes. These are the most right then things that you would expect to have if you taught a child something or if you provided a direct service to somebody. The interim being those skills or behaviors that are then encouraged to change as a result of the introduction of new knowledge or information. And then with time, we're able to practice those skills or behavior. We build habits, we build, and then that changes health status or conditions. So this is the theoretical approach to the sequential, stepwise introduction of the outcomes. So for Module 2, we talked about sampling and measurement methods. We talked about specifically intervention and how to monitor intervention elements. And we talked about research, or really evaluation design. I try to stay away from that word research when I'm talking about program evaluation. A lot of same concepts, but really, did we achieve that goal? I felt a little less successful. So when I looked at the pre and the post test, this time I actually got the IDs numbers lined up, so I knew I could see with in-person change. What I saw was that 66% actually correctly identified the concepts that I was asking about at pre-test, whereas 77 correctly identified those measurement concepts at pre-test or at post-test. This is an 11% increase. It is statistically significant. There were 35 participants. It's about a 0.4 effect is what that would suggest, which is a mild to moderate effect for the training in terms of increasing knowledge. Why I say I'm a little disappointed, there's a couple of things I think about that data that really, first of all, we had a high ceiling effect to start with. A lot of folks knew the questions that I was asking already. And that's great, but I didn't move the needle as much. You know, when you have a high propensity or within your population that you're studying, they're already in a good place, then there's less room to improve. And that is a real statistical, what we call a ceiling effect. I also think that another way of thinking about this process, it may have been that my questions were not accurately tapping areas of knowledge that were not known. So I think that this is an area that we can use a little bit more consultation and direct support. Training is great, but really all of you do very idiosyncratic things, have different populations you work with, and almost when you're talking about measurement for program outcomes as well as process, it's almost a consultation requirement where we've got to sit down and really talk about what kind of things you do and what kind of measurement or information you need to collect to improve things. I provided this example last time. So this is the Buddy Pack program. It's a logic model that puts together all of those pieces. And then the part that I expanded upon last time really looked at the measurement of these initial, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. And then I provided this mess of information up on the screen. What I would say is this, that this is probably an extreme scientific version of what it is that I'm talking about. When many of you, it's not necessarily required that you have all of this information so much as that you're looking at your process. I recently had some really good experience with sitting down with some of the folks from Love Inc. And I'm going to bring them up in a little bit to show them so they can show you their database. But really looking at their process and what it is that they wanted to change. You know, there are not a lot of measures, but they're collecting a lot of relevant information in their process that can be used to report outcomes. So, you know, really looking at what it is that they were doing, looking at the information they're already capturing, and how can we maybe quantify some of that or look at it in a different way to use it as an outcome. So not every concept that you're trying to change is going to necessarily have a psychometrically sound instrument. You may be looking at status or other things that don't have reliability or validity scores. These are certainly for psychometric instruments that are measuring things like depression or anxiety. So just know that that's not necessarily required of every outcome. This is just an extreme example. I don't think I really said that last time, and some people were like, whoa. One of the things that we did talk about last time as well, and I needed to talk about briefly this morning because it has a lot of implications for data analysis, are levels of measurement. There are only certain statistical procedures or ways of analyzing certain data. All of these 4 levels of measurement really build upon the characteristics of each. So nominal measures, an example of a nominal measure is what? I've got it written right up there. Sex, gender. These are categorical or really descriptive things about people that we use to describe a sample, or we use to describe who it is that we serve at our agency. Ordinal data, there's a lot of discussion between what's ordinal and what's interval. But ordinal data, really in its most clear essence, these are Likert scales. These are attitudinal Likert scales that we ask people their opinions about things. We do some fancy stuff with ordinal level data in order to make it interval level data so that we can do some other tricky statistical things with it. It's a dirty secret in social sciences, but since we all play by those rules, it's not really a problem. Interval level data is really that there are some meaningful differences between numbers, but there's no true 0 point. So an IQ is a good example of interval level data, how we measure IQ. Time of day or temperature is also another common example. Ratio level data has all of those characteristics, but it has a true 0 point. And with ratio level data, what makes this really important is that we can actually do division and create averages. You know, with a true 0 point, then when we do division, the number has meaning. If you do division with ordinal or with interval level data, it actually doesn't have true meaning. So that's one of the issues that we have with those levels of measurement. Questions about anything lingering from those first 2 modules, something burning, something I said that didn't sit well with you? Nick?
Can you say just a little bit more about Likert scale and what that means?
So the term scale is pretty general in social sciences. It can refer to an entire instrument that's measuring a similar concept where there are multiple items that load on it. So when we measure depression, I like that one because everybody has a familiarity with it. When we measure depression, we really look at multiple indicators of depression, such as sleep patterns, such as eating patterns, such as mood lability, so on and so forth. And so when we look, those are all highly correlated. When individuals endorse those items and we show that their scores basically highly correlate, it indicates that they may have a state of depression. So we use those individual indicators to identify a latent construct, a thing that we can't see really. Like we can't see depression, but we can measure the behaviors that are associated with sleep and with eating and so on and so forth. But were you referring more, so that would be a scale in the general measurement sense. Were you referring more to the levels of measurement?
I guess the word Likert is used often.
The word Likert is used. So a Likert, it is a scale. So the word Likert, well, it was a man's name who invented a way of measurement. We take this is an ordinal scale, a Likert item. How much do you like? Fill in the blank. Not much, a little bit, so on and so forth. And basically an individual, so we could do that with depression, for example. And we could create 5 or 6 items that would ask somebody about their mood and how they've been feeling lately. What you can do, and I'll show you this in a little bit, on how we create those, what I would call scale scores or subscale scores, is that we would add up all of those individual numbers that people would endorse or select, and we would divide by the number of response options. So if we just use one of those items, there are only 5 response options available. It's very coarse. So there's not a lot of variation between individuals. There's only 5 chances for individuals to vary on that one item. But when we add those items up and we create subscales out of them, we put decimal points in there. And it allows individuals to fall along a number, literally dependent upon the size of the scale, lots of different points. And so we get variation, and therefore the scale itself, when we ramp those items up and create actually a scale out of them, the scale itself will be more sensitive to change. I'll kind of try to demonstrate that in a little bit, but it's a really relevant question for today. Anything else? Okay. Please stop me if, as Peggy says, I use a $5 word or I've completely confused you. Sometimes I confuse myself. So just don't feel bad about jumping out and stopping me. So data management, this is where the process starts. We have to manage data in order to make it useful. It's got to be in numeric format for us to analyze it. We can do some qualitative analysis, and I'll touch on that briefly. But really, most funders want us to report things in numbers. Numbers communicate a little bit more. There's a lot of fuzziness around qualitative analysis and a lot of debate. But we start with data coding and entry, and then certainly checking that data for any errors. Thinking about, and I think that ways of reducing errors, we can talk about some data storage and some, making it efficient, and thinking about some available processes that are easy. Sounds like Tim is working on some other ways for folks to have access to storing and reporting some of this information. And then just a few caveats we'll talk about before we move on to analytical procedures. So developing a database structured codebook, no matter whether you're using Excel or Access or you're using an online platform, you need to have a database codebook that is going to identify for you what exactly is the information you're putting into that data set. An example of a codebook, and I don't think there's any one way to do this, but for example, if you have for ID, the variable ID, you have two attributes or values that you would enter that represent these attributes. Attributes are any variation within a variable. So the variable is ID, and it has two attributes in this example. If you had a variable gender, it would have, or sex, sorry, you would have two attributes with that, male and female. So you assign a number and then just put a note so that you always know that this is what a 0 and this is what a 1 is. It also helps if you're running an agency and you have interns come in. You can hand them the code book. You can hand them your surveys. You can say, here, please enter this data. Here's what it means. So having a code book is super helpful for every variable that you input. Having a code book, some of them require maybe a little bit more of some notes. So there's some space to put some notes around what some of those things mean. So some data are obviously easy to code, so Likert scales may have a number associated with them. Survey data may already have a number associated with it, age, so on and so forth. Some data need to be coded. If you're asking in a survey, are you female or are you male, you need to assign numerical values to those attributes. It's easier in a database to assign each variable a shortened or a shorthand name. That should go in your code book so that you know if you provide a shorthand name. Make the name meaningful to you. I would recommend keeping it in lowercase values, keeping it all in the same case. A capital M to some programs is not the same as a small m, and it will read it differently. Avoid any special characters because some programs use these as code, and it will confuse the program. And don't leave any spaces. So if you do want a space, use that underscore, and that will help you. Keep ideas within your shortened names kind of separated. Using an ID number if you are collecting paper copies still and you have files and that's comfortable for you. Definitely making sure the ID number is listed on the file on every piece of paper in that file that goes into an electronic database so that you can track back. Double entry will avoid errors. So if you have the resources to have two people enter data, that's nice. Most of you don't, so you're probably going to end up just doing some random checks. So you pull a file and just look at the data randomly and make sure that it looks good. So these are some strategies for just making sure that the data is entered properly. The data is only as good as what gets entered into the system. Most of your time is spent in this process of preparing it. And then I would also say that coding and entry, just some basic things. Columns are variables. These are the concepts that you're looking to represent. Each cell should contain only 1 byte of information. Avoid using any text in those cells. Will confuse the program, and it won't be able to use that cell of information. It will omit it. It will omit the whole case. Most programs do it that way. Use mutually exclusive codes or answers. Now, this should already be an issue taken care of by your measure. Your measure should have a response set. So your Likert scale should have a response set that is mutually exclusive, and you can't be 2 of those responses at the same time, is basically what I mean by that. And they're exhaustive, that there's not another option in the world for you to select from. That's why we usually use those coarse response sets like rarely, never, always. Kind of force people's hand to answer. When it comes to entering some numeric data, use the same unit. So if we're measuring things in inches, don't enter data in feet. If we're measuring the month and day, or putting in the month, day, and the year, use the same format all the time. I recommend using this because most computer or statistical software can read this format right here, and you can translate it into number of days since birth, or you can look at another event by creating code. You can look at a half-life, for example. But most software can read that, including Excel and Access. Although I don't know, you said they changed it in Access, did they? It's not this format anymore.
Well, they just changed the way they handle it in the background. So
Okay. Missing data conventions. If you're lucky enough to never have any, that's awesome. But typically, most of us have to deal with it on some level or not. In Excel, you can leave cells blank. It will basically do a case-wise deletion. Or you can use a number, a consistent number such as 999. It's kind of a nonsensical number, but it allows you then to identify where your missing data are and omit them. Or there are some statistical software programs that actually can analyze the data, and there are different methods and ways of using missing information. What researchers or statisticians will say is that 6% or less is ignorable. So if you're concerned about missing data and you're getting ready to do an analysis, and you look and see how much missing data do I have on this particular variable, if you have a 999 in the cells, you can basically calculate the percentage of how many of those responses or cells have a 999 in them. If it's less than 6%, you know you don't have a problem. If it's more, I will tell you to seek consultation because it's more than I want to go into today. Avoid using zeros for missing data. Zeros a lot of times have numerical meaning in the data set, so avoid using zeros. So an example of what I'm talking about there, so different response formats for date of birth. It's not going to be helpful. It's not a problem to use decimals for weight, but it's certainly a problem to put text in the cell. Here we've got different units of measure for height. That's not going to work out very well when we try to analyze it. Putting text in for a Likert scale response or a missing NA for a missing option is going to be problematic. So definitely keeping it numeric, and this is the value of the code book. So you've got this data set, you've got your numbers entered, and you want to kind of start to look at it. First thing you need to do is to check the data and make sure that it's accurate. So you can do this by pulling some random case files and seeing if the data are entered accurately first and foremost. Are there missing responses? Are there odd responses? Did somebody hit an extra 9 when they were entering some information? This creates an outlier that obviously if you're going to construct a mean of all of those numbers in that column, having an outlier is going to pull that mean in the direction of that outlier. It's going to create problems in the analysis. So thinking about transforming some of your items. So this is kind of this is pretty straightforward, but sometimes sticky. It takes me a minute to kind of get my head wrapped around items that are negatively or positively worded. So I put an example up here. So let's say this is a depression scale. We have somebody rating, do you have negative thoughts? And they say, I always have negative thoughts. Do you feel good? Those two items are worded in the opposite direction. And we need to recode one or the other of them. So we need to make a decision about which direction we want our items to be. If we want higher on the scale to indicate that if you are higher on the scale that you have depression, then we would want to recode feeling good in the other direction. We want to make that 1 a 5, or if it was a 2, we'd make it a 4. So we recode it in the opposite direction. If we have negative thoughts, it's a 5, and feel good is a 1, and we add up these items to come up with a subscale score, we're going to end up with a 9, for example. If we recode it, where feel good is now equal to a 5, and we add that up, we end up with a 13 raw. These are called raw subscale scores. So there's a big difference between that 9 and that 13 when we go to analyze that data. So we need to be mindful of those items. The other way to avoid this is just to make sure that your measurement instruments are all worded in the same direction. But sometimes some psychosocial instruments negatively word and positively word alternate these items because they want to make sure that they are getting true responses from respondents. Some people, you know how it is, man, you just rock down the scale and just enter it and I'm done. Happens all the time. If you have recoded it, it helps to definitely keep the original column of the original data, but then create a new column for feelgood _ R for recode, something to that nature, whatever works for you. And then, to your point, Nick, computing subscales that will allow us more variation on this information in which to detect change. So we've got a raw subscale score of 13 if we add up the items. But if we divide by the response options, of which there are 5, we end up with a 2.6 score for that individual. So that introduces a decimal point on which individuals can vary along those decimal points, and it creates a more sensitive scale. That's the little trick we do in social sciences to avoid that ordinal problem. Questions on any of that so far? So just a few considerations. You know, we are definitely living in an age of data. Who owns it? It's debatable. Certainly client rights, obviously. Yes, sir?
On the previous screen, where did the 3 come from? 5 plus 1, 5 plus 1 plus
I think it was this one here. This is my example, maybe. So we would recode this so it would be a 5. And then suicidal thoughts would be off, and so we would add the 5, and the 3, if this was our subscale. I mean, I made this up, so don't use this as an example. It's not psychometrically sound. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, so 9 is an accurate thing.
Right. So the 9 would be as if we added that without recoding the feeling good. Yeah. Or did I add wrong? Thanks for clearing it up. Certainly obtaining informed consent. The agency owns the data once we have informed consent, but certainly if we share, we need to have consent from the individual to share it as well. They need to know what we're going to do with it.
Dr. Thompson, on that, is that we need informed consent to share individual data or also to aggregate data?
Well, once you aggregate it, it's a little different. You can report it without, but I think even for those purposes, like informed consent is really telling individuals what we're going to do with it. If part of it is that we are going to share it with a specific agency, they need to be informed of that. But in terms of informed consent for an agency's purpose, it would be we are using it to report to our funding agencies. We may use some of this aggregated data in, let's say, flyers, or information about our agency in terms of what, some of the things that we have done. And then I think a caveat of saying we will never identify or release any personal information is always a good thing to tell folks about.
Our expectation as
Right.
from the individual client. We don't want to have people sharing individual client data unless it is part of a collective effort among agencies with agreements for a combined or collaborative case management system.
Right, so in that case, you'd have a double door consent procedure, in which case the individuals would be fully informed of who you are sharing their data with. And I think that along those lines, in terms of data security and storage, having a de-identified data set where there's a crosswalk data set, so you've got just IDs. The ID is the unique piece of information that connects every unique case. Because you know a lot about this, so your hand shot up. Please share. So having a crosswalk data set where you actually have the identifying information, maybe the name and the address of the respondent, and then the ID next to their name, and then you've got a separate ID, or you've got a separate data set with just the ID, no names, no addresses or identifying information. And then you could allow your employees to work with that data set while keeping, while there may be just a few people who have access to that more secure and personal information, is one way to kind of manage that process. We have to do this a lot like if I work in research with children a lot, and so protecting their names, and school districts are very protective of that. There are ways around this to collect information where you don't necessarily know the individuals, identifying information, but when you're managing that information, these are just a couple of strategies to consider. Yeah.
But if you want to track an individual, you have to know the name and so forth. So.
Yeah, pretty much. I think we do have to collect names. I think there are a couple of pieces of information we have to have. Name, date of birth, address. Those are unique identifiers that when we have 3 of them, we are never going to get the same person. When we're dealing with huge data sets, there could potentially be lots of people in there with the name Mary Johnson. There could be a couple of Mary Johnsons have the same date of birth. And maybe somebody, could potentially put in a typo that caused 2 addresses to be the same. Less likely, though, when you're using all 3 of those pieces of information to triangulate and identify a unique person. Yeah, I think we do have to collect that information.
Especially internally. The agency has to have, I would think, has to have that data.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you have to use that identifying data.
Right. Precisely. Precisely. Yeah, that's why I think like if you're the head or the director of an agency, you've got multiple interns or other folks that are not maybe employees in your agency coming through and they're working and entering data in your data set, protecting that information is paramount. And so maybe you want to have a crosswalk data set where they just got access. You've got your key front sheet where you're collecting that demographic information. That's pulled separate. It's got the ID number on it that matches the ID on everything else. But you're pulling that separate, entering it into the crosswalk, and then you give all the information to somebody else to enter it into the spreadsheet or the database. Make sense? I don't know, anybody else do it differently? I'm sure some of you have databases or systems for working with some of this information. Holler if you do. What? You talk. You laughing back there in the corner.
Because the reality is that we're a small organization and we're not there, and so a lot of this is going.
Okay.
And so, but I know I'm not the only one in the room, and I just didn't want to ask a question. But for us that are beginning, or for I say for our organization, we're not there yet. We're probably looking at what database to use, but we're thankful for ETOs because this is the start for us dealing with that direction. But especially for the scales that you were producing before, I was just like.
But conceptually, you get it, yeah.
But practicality of using, I was like,
Mm-hmm.
but at the same time, I'm excited because it means I need to have a session with you, like I said I would before.
Yeah, absolutely. My information is at the end of this, and if you want consultation, I will be happy to come out and talk with you. Back up really quick. Make sure you back this data up on a regular basis. Just have a schedule. Google Docs is nice. There are some security issues with using Google Docs, obviously. Another way to deal with this is a secure email, just emailing it to yourself and maybe one other person, using an external drive or burning it on a disk. A couple of ways, so if you are a starting out organization, I'm going to show just a couple of databases. One I created as a principal to track behavior in my building. Another, Kelly's going to come up and show you Love Inc.'s database, which I was just blown away by because they have created this and wrapped it around their process and have something very unique, I think. So, but first, so this will be, you get an office disciplinary referral, for example. Lots of schools are collecting this information, but lots of schools are also farming it out and paying money. I didn't want to pay money because I'm cheap. And so I created my own database in Excel. Excel is a flat database, whereas Access is a relational database and a little bit more complex, but Excel is pretty straightforward. So my secretary would enter this information in on this front page sheet here. You can insert drop-down boxes that would have, for example, teachers' names, and you just select from the drop-down box. This reduces input errors of spelling somebody's name wrong. Day of the week, random information about where the behavior occurred. And I can kind of do some consultation around setting something up like this if you're interested. But ultimately what happens is it counts each one of those values that you enter and it drops it into a box on this. It's kind of a crosswalk page or a link page. But that's not very useful for me. So what I want is I want real-time data so that I can take a look at it and I can see what's happening. So I would take a look at creating graphics. So these would be total referrals per month. Or if I was interested in knowing what's my hot day of the week so that I can be a little bit more ready, let's say on a Friday, Monday, or Tuesday. Actually, this is all mock data. One of the worst days, maybe this is similar to CPS, one of the worst days in schools is a Wednesday. Look at it by location. I mean, if I'm thinking as a principal that I've got issues in my classroom, well, that's where kids spend most of their time. But alternatively, on the playground, maybe I need to look at what I'm doing supervision-wise on the playground. What time of day? What's happening from 10 to 11? Where are my hotspots? Where are my referrals coming from? So this is, just ways to think about using this in the process of running my school building. Gender, race, grade. I may say, well, fifth graders obviously developmentally have some issues, but we're, maybe need to ramp up our efforts to target or reduce problem behaviors amongst fifth graders as opposed to spending resources on kindergartners. In Excel, you can do some crosstabs. So for example, one of the things I always paid attention to were the total number of referrals by staff member, because sometimes individuals don't necessarily like a child, or a child is aggravating an adult. And so I would want to know and keep tabs on that, so that if I saw an uptick in that, I could have a conversation with a faculty member. So pretty straightforward percentages. I can use those percentages from year to year, set benchmarks, and hopefully reduce the number of referrals I would get month to month. So useful information. Would you like to come up and swap with me? I want Kelly to show you what they have got, because I really like what they've done. So let's just pull this off of you.
All right, well, as Dr. Thompson was just pointing out his Excel spreadsheet, Mary and I were going, that doesn't make a lot of sense to us. We use Access, and this is a 2007 version. We started this before we actually even applied for United Way funding. Mary is our computer guru. And so when Love Inc. first started, and we're going to be 6 years old in May, we did everything paper pencil. And then when Mary came on board, how long ago was that, Mary?
Almost 3 years.
3 years ago, because she loved doing computer programming, she decided on her own to develop this for us. As Love Inc. has started collecting more and more information, she customizes it for us. And so when we talk to clients first on the phone, and it's about a 20 to a 30-minute intake, depending on how talkative the client is. And then at some point, if they're interested in getting involved, we have them come into the office. But we enter the information directly into this database, as we're talking to the client, we have a headset on and we're entering this. Each client has their own ID number, and we just, right from the start, we start, putting them in case categories, looking at all this. Mary, would you go to client details? And so we collect quite a bit of demographic information. We work with refugees, so we had to add this English question so we could make sure we had translators. We also, on the connected people, I don't know if that'll open, but in that section, yeah, Mary put these funny little names in. We make sure that we find out everyone in their household who we're helping that's under 18. We get the sex. We also find out the relationship, disabled, veteran, all of that pretty quickly as we're starting out our intake. Mary, would you go to the full intake? So this is our biopsychosocial assessment that we do with every client. And we ask a lot of questions. We need this information because we're in the clearinghouse, which is what this is in the safety net part, but also we report to the national levy. And so a lot of this information was information we've been collecting for a long time because they want to know some things like needs met and, how many families with children and things like that. So go ahead to the second page, Mary. We, right from the start talking about the housing status, and under that, Mary, on the unknown there, can you do that drop-down box? We get that information. We have several places we try to keep track of the homeless people because we do that point in time with the health department, with Steve, whenever he asks. And so we can pull that information really quickly and just tell you these are the homeless people right now. And then all of this helps us because we look at the biopsychosocial assessment. Now that we are in our new proposal, in our new strategy, we're changing some of our questions around. After I met with Dr. Thompson, we're going to change some of these questions to make them Likert scale. So that's going to be our baseline. As soon as we're talking to the client, we're going to be changing these questions, so automatically we have baseline information. And then we will do it again because we follow up a lot with our clients. And some of them we follow over a year, depending on their situation. But we're going to be asking these questions again at different time points, so then we can get that post-test information as well. Okay, Mary, you can move to the next page. No, go on to page 3. We ask a lot about their social support, and as you'll see a little bit, we also ask about employment and education. At Love Inc., we have some internal programs that help people find jobs, careers, whatever that might be. But we also like to look at relational poverty. How many people do they have in their lives? Do they have someone, a support system? Do they have, what's their social support system look like? And so, because we believe that's extremely important, informational and relational poverty are related, we feel like, from research that we've read, to material poverty. And so that's why we want to look at that. So as we're going through this and asking all these questions in our, we call it the BPSA, we're also, Myra and I, and we're both social workers, are thinking about a score that we do on their social and occupational functioning. Because we're hoping that through their connection with us and the information we provide, the services we provide, the programs that we offer, maybe it's a referral, a connection in the community, that we're going to improve that score somehow. We want them to have more people in their lives. We want them to have more information. And we want to help them to pull that all together and figure out how to use that to improve their lives. 4, Mary. Yeah, and also we ask them about a church connection because that we feel like that can be another part of their support system. Page 5, Mary. And then we do these drop-down boxes. We look at employment and education. Like I said, we have job search coaches at our agency that do individual coaching, and then we also have adult tutoring. So we want to kind of see if those are any barriers right now to them moving forward. We get a lot of information on goals because we're going to set goals with the clients that want to move forward. And right now we have a whole different form that we use where we find out, we're talking with them about the goals, the steps they're going to take to reach those goals. We use SMART goals. And we're going to check off to see how many people are completing their goals. And we'd like at some point to look at, if you completed goals, did that correlate with your social and occupational functioning, the completion of those goals. And we have to get lots of information about their income because we have donors in the community that want to look at their income and expenses. They want to know, is this sustainable? So go ahead, Mary, to the next page. And to 8. So this is the page where we actually had one of the professors at the School of Social Work, Myra, took it in to look at our BPSA, and she said, why do you ask all this negative stuff on this, deep stuff on the last page? We're hoping by then they're a little more comfortable talking to us. And because we're trying to, even though these are the questions we ask, we try to delve a little deeper in those questions depending on each situation so that we can just keep identifying any barriers that's keeping them from moving forward, getting a job, whatever it might be. And so we have a lot of people with a criminal history that contact us. We need to know that because that's a huge barrier for housing and for employment. You all know that. We also like if people are struggling in addiction, we want to try to connect them if they're interested to some kind of recovery program. But as you see, some of these questions here are just boxes that you check. And at any point, Mary can collect that for me and run me a report and say, this is how many people we've done intakes on, and this is how many people have a criminal history. And she can also show me a report that this was the age, and this was going on, and these are the demographics, and at any point using the system. And it works really well for us. I don't know what we do without it at this point, but, and so you can't see it on here, but we also just have another page. Mary, can you just go to the form page, even though we can't open it? So we have Extra Miles, another one of our programs, as you can see the name all over the place. In the clearinghouse, we use the 2-week survey, and it'll have some Likert scale questions on it that will be the same Likert scale questions we asked in our BPSA. And then we will, the goals and objectives form, that is where we're going to also give them a score for their social and occupational functioning. And then we're going to do that at several time points. And we're just as new to outcomes as maybe some of you guys are. So when I was talking to Jane, our program director, about this, she said, her greatest fear is there won't be any change. But I said, but that's okay, because we're trying to move forward, and we're trying to figure out why isn't there? I mean, logically, this should happen, so why isn't it happening? And so now that we're collecting all this, we can really delve down to the deeper stuff and look at, well, it's this age group, or it's male versus females, or it's this minority, or what is it that is not, is the thing that is keeping them from increasing their score.
It can allow you to look at maybe cases that folks don't reach goals and see if there are specific indicators that might be predictive of that and how we could build greater supports around those folks.
Right.
So thinking about using the process, information in a process manner like that, I think is where the key is.
Yeah, and that's the information we collect, and it's just ongoing. And so, like I said, at any point, if we're writing any kind of grant and it's around a certain thing that you're writing it for, we can go in and just pull that data. Mary, I make it sound like it's really quick, but she has a lot of reports already written to where she can just say, okay, here you go. In fact, I want to know right now, how are we doing on our 2014, logic model? I want to know what's that look like. So I'm going to, just go tell Mary, hey, can you run me these numbers so I can see if we're doing what we're saying we're going to do. We're into the second quarter, and I want to look at that. So that's how it works for us. Does anybody have any questions about that?
And with the goals that you're setting, I'm just curious, since you talked about trying to show relationship between things, do you have kind of, from the get-go, some set formulas for the goals, like, that you guys see, like, pretty commonly? These are the types of goals we're going to look for, like, for example, having your own home or having an apartment or something like that. Do you
Yes.
guys kind of have that structure set up initially?
Well, at the end of our BPSA, because we always call back after we process everything, we kind of triage and figure out, what we can do. We staff. Myra and I are like, okay, this looks like this. We can provide this. We tell them before we hang up, we're going to call you back. We're going to talk to you about some goals. And so think of some short-term goals, not some 5 years down the road, but some short-term goals that we can help you with. Well, a lot of people call us and they need a job or they need housing. And so when Myra calls them back, that may be the 2 goals they want to work on. I need to get a new job. So we start breaking that down into little objectives, into little action steps. And we check those off every time we talk to them. Are they completing these? Are they working on this? And so it's very helpful. But yeah, most of the people, it's pretty quick. Some of them want to go back to school, housing, job. What's some others you see, Myra?
Mostly a lot of employment, housing, those are the.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing that we got into discussion about is how do you quantify something like that? So if you've got a goal with 5 objectives, every time you mark off an objective, you are 20% closer to achieving that goal. So just thinking about the number of objectives listed in a goal, quantifying it, giving it a numeric number allows us to kind of keep track of where we are in the process. And maybe a client's got multiple goals, so you can really, once all objectives are achieved and the goal is reached, you should have a 1 in that cell. Mm-hmm. And then you add those up over time. If they've got 5 goals, but they've only got 2 of them achieved, then you've got a percentage of completion there. But just thinking creatively about ways that of information we're already collecting, rather than saying, well, I need to collect all this other stuff on top of what I'm already doing, but not really having a benefit or at helping the process, I think is where the creativity comes in. So, yeah, pretty cool.
Okay.
Thank you so much for showing everybody that. I just think the work they've done is awesome. And of course, it helps when you have somebody that knows Access. It is a relational database. It can be a little bit complex. Excel's a little bit more straightforward. And on that note, what I have done for the rest of this morning is to really then, what do we do with the rest of this data now that we've got it? And I teach stats to my graduate students who are going to go out and work in agencies, deliver direct services to folks. I teach them stats in Excel because, to be honest with you, a lot of social service agencies don't have the $150, $200 every year to purchase a new license for statistical software. Some folks do, not everybody does. And so these things can be done in Excel. And so along with this next phase of the training, there are a couple of documents, I think, in your handouts. One is about a 7 or 8 page long kind of walkthrough on some specific procedures that I'm going to kind of show you. I've also sent Kara an Excel database or like a data sheet that goes along with that, and she can email that out to everyone. And then there are a couple of other handouts that just kind of walk through the process of calculating things like a standard deviation or conducting or doing a chi-square if you have multiple groups. These are pretty straightforward statistics. I like math, so I kind of like solving the problem. But for those of you that maybe don't, I hopefully have explained it enough that it will keep you from pulling your hair out. First, I'm just going to talk really briefly about qualitative analysis, because I think qualitative analysis often gets the short end of the stick when we talk about trying to understand program processes. If there's something we're trying to get at in terms of a problem, it can really be helpful to conduct Focus groups. Let's say if we're trying to address the problem of homelessness in Columbia and we want to know what are the barriers to services for homeless individuals, having 8 to 10 of those individuals come in for a cup of coffee and a conversation where we can ask them some questions, we can record some of their responses, and then we can look across their responses to see if we see some commonalities is the idea of qualitative research. And typically we do a lot of qualitative research on concepts we don't understand well because we're not able to develop numeric scales that relevantly tap those ideas. And so this is the idea of qualitative analysis. There are a couple of different approaches. One of them is what's known as an open coding method. I took a couple passages from the Bible here to just kind of relate an idea of how you might analyze this information. So you've got, let's say, recorded conversations with 8 individuals, and then after you get this transcribed, it's a very laborious process. But after you get this transcribed, going through and highlighting bits of discourse or bits of information that seem to be appearing in each person's conversation or what it is that they're saying, you're noticing some patterns in the data. You can use a highlighting tool in Word, for example, and then, of course, creating a code book indicating what each one of those codes mean using some memos. So that's kind of the third step of that process. And then once you have all those codes, kind of gathering all of them, going through your document, gathering each highlighted code, dumping it on a separate document so that you've got them all lined up next to each other, and you can see each piece of information that maybe each of your 8 individuals commented on. It seems similar, and trying to make new meaning or constructing new meaning out of those concepts themselves. And ways of doing that, you can count the frequency number of times that individuals mention a certain concept. So that would be kind of a way of almost treating it quantitatively, giving it a number. You can create a concept map. So in my example, you could say abominations lead to, so on and so forth. Discuss magnitudes. Maybe you notice that there are various attributes to those concepts, that there are various levels of severity. Or then just discussing it in if this happens, then this happens, kind of if-then relationships. And you use your narrative. So here's a concept that I've noticed, and here are several examples from the interviews that I've done. So you use some of that information to try to support the concepts. There's another approach called thematic analysis in qualitative research or evaluation. It's where you already have a preconceived idea or theory about how something works. You collect focus group information and you apply those preconceived ideas, giving them a code name, and looking through the information to say, aha, there it is, aha, there it is, aha, there it is. There's a risk in this with all qualitative analysis because it is so laborious. We generally have small sample sizes. And with small sample sizes plus somebody who has an agenda, we can equal confirmation bias. We can end up finding things that we really want to find. We can confirm our already pre-existing ideas, which kind of defeats the purpose of true evaluation. So it's something to be aware of and be cautious about with thematic analysis. It's more of almost like a deductive, inductive approach to thinking about qualitative research. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about quantitative analysis because, again, that's where the money is. That's what funders want to see. And I'm going to speak about it in 3 broad strokes. Well, actually 2 broad strokes because I'm not going to talk about multivariate analysis. I'm going to talk about univariate and bivariate approaches to analyzing some of the data that you all could collect, and including giving you some strategies to use Excel to analyze and give you some responses on these issues. Multivariate analysis starts to get pretty sticky, and there's a lot of rules to know about it. They're all based upon these 2 lower level statistical families of procedures, but there is a lot to know in terms of how we treat the data, how we analyze errors, and how some of those equations are used to answer those questions, including some of the structures in the data that are useful, but I would say if you're feeling you need more complex approaches, drop me a note, we can talk. So univariate statistics, it's really about one variable at a time, just becoming familiar with your data. The purpose is to describe the persons who are in your data set or the variables, looking at distributions. Trying to understand, for example, what are the mean, the median, or the mode around those values. Equations scare people sometimes. This is a pretty straightforward equation. Typically we use the x bar to indicate arithmetic mean and the sigma sign to indicate sum, which is, so basically how this formula reads is the mean is equal to the sum of all individual responses on x divided by all the individuals in the data set, with the n being the number of persons that you have in the data set. On each of these slides, I have inserted the Excel codes to calculate, for example, if you have an entire column of, let's say, ages, and you want to know what's the average age of all individuals in my data set, then at the bottom of that line or that column, you can enter equals and average and make sure that all of those cells that have the ages are selected, and it will give you the average age of all individuals in your data set. The median is the central two values listed. Typically with this in Excel, you need, and this is on your example sheet as you get a chance to maybe sit down and go over this later, which I'm sure you will, or tuck it away until you need it. Typically you have to order all of the data, so if you have ages, you would order them from the youngest person to the oldest person, and then the program's able to find the central value. You know, Excel's a little rough. It's not as advanced as some statistical programs, but it's free and it's accessible. If you have an even number of values, you're doing this by hand, obviously you select the two central values and add them and divide by 2. That will give you the median. The mode is just simply your most frequently occurring value. So the worksheet that I was talking about is this doodad here. There's some instructions at the start of this. There are some data analysis. There's a data analysis toolkit that any person that has a Microsoft license for the Office suite can download this free from the web. And here are the directions on how to download it. I'll show you briefly. If you go over to Files, down here there's a button for options. It will pull up a window. And what you want to do is go to add-ins, and this is all in those instructions. So I'm just going to fly through and just show it to you really quick. And there's an analysis tool pack right here that you'll hit OK. If that is not listed there, go to this drop-down box, select the add-ons, and hit Go, and then it will find it on the web. Now, I've already got it loaded, so I don't need to hit OK. And then basically, to make sure that it loaded OK, you'll go to this Data tab at the top, and then make sure that your Data Analysis Tool Pack is loaded on your toolbar. What that looks like is there are multiple analytical strategies on here. We're going to talk about ANOVAs today and correlation. We're going to talk about creating histograms and several t-tests. Yes, ma'am?
When you're in a Excel worksheet, when you went to that and loaded it, so does that mean that the data pack is only loaded in that worksheet, or is it now on your computer?
It's now on your computer, you're right. So I can load, yeah, I can load any new worksheet. I can start a new worksheet, and it should be on your data toolbar in there, yeah. Okay, so we can start with a couple of examples here. So around creating averages, medians, and identifying modes in a data set, the first example here, I give you just I don't know, I created a bunch of numbers. And let's just say these are a number of car accidents in Missouri on an annual basis. Finding the mean and the mode, the median around those numbers by simply inserting them in Excel in a column. I came down here, and then if you look up in this toolbar up here, or the function bar, it will give you the equation. When you highlight all that, when you highlight that information, it will put it right up there. So otherwise, you can just type it in. If you can type, it will create this drop-down box. If you double-click on it, it's going to ask you for which range of numbers you want. just go ahead and select your numbers, hit enter, and it will create that average for you. The other approach to doing this is pretty straightforward. Excel does have this sum button up here in which a lot of commonly used functions are listed under it. So you can create an average, you can do a frequency count of the numbers there, you can find your range, your max or your minimum. And there are other functions under there. So those are for commonly used things that you might need. So that's pretty straightforward. So I've done that on all of these problems in that Excel worksheet as well as the PDF that you've got in front of you. So Kara will make sure to email the Excel sheet out to everybody, just so they'd have the electronic document to go along with the written document. Awesome. Okay. If you want to find your range, so univariate analysis is good for figuring out where their central tendencies are in the data. That's important, especially if you've got outliers. If your central tendencies seem to be off. If you have, here's kind of a raw understanding of central tendency. If your mean, your median, and your mode are the same number, you have a perfect distribution, bell-shaped curve distribution. So unless you have what's called completely kurtotic, in which everybody's got the same number in that data set. So if you've got I should add that caveat. If you've got variation, if you've got a standard deviation, but your mean, median, and your mode are the same number, are really close, you've got a nice distribution. When data are skewed, that will affect analyses and how we interpret that data. And there's a lot to know about some of these things, but really how you understand the distribution of scores around the mean is through the standard deviation. And this is a very important statistic. We square the standard deviation because if we actually subtracted every score from the mean, we'd end up with a 0, and it makes it meaningless for use in calculations. So just know that. And I provided a, let's see, in terms of calculating the standard deviation, here's your formula in Excel on that worksheet. It's also listed here. And almost every problem in that Excel sheet, I calculate standard deviation. So here it is here. And again, if you are doing that in Excel, you're going to get a couple of options for a standard deviation. Really, you want to pick the standard deviation with an S, or this one down here, which just is standard deviation. This basically means the standard deviation of a sample. The standard deviation of a p, you're not going to get much of a different value that's really going to make any difference, but it's really referring to a population and it uses a different denominator. So really what you want is that one. So again, you would just select your range of values and it would give you your standard deviation. Really for the standard deviation, it is a pretty straightforward. So if you'd have a raw number that would represent a concept or an attribute on a concept in a data set in the column, so each case is a line. You calculate your mean or your average. You then subtract each response or the average from each response. Now if you sum those, you're going to end up with a 0, so we square them. And this will give us a value from which we call the sum of squares. And then we divide it by the number of individuals in our data set minus 1. This is the degrees of freedom that is required to create the statistic. So it's not the perfect standard deviation, but it's within a decimal point of being very close. And then our final response, to get our final response, you can just take the square root of it. Or you can just use Excel and hit in equals and standard deviation, select the data, and it'll do it for you. Love computers. And then here's just a simple worksheet if you do want to practice it, because I like to practice this stuff. And so I think, here's the thing. But here's the thing about stats, and if you're working with data from your agency, you need to know what's happening, I think. Like, why do we create this calculation? Why do we square it? Well, if we don't square it, then we end up with a meaningful or meaningless number. What exactly does a standard deviation mean? So I think that working with it by hand can really drill it into your head sometimes. And that's important, especially if you have to stand up and talk to people about what my data mean. So I just provide those little worksheets. If you want to sit, if you're sitting at home on a Sunday, you're bored, like, oh, I really feel like calculating a standard deviation, then you have it. So once we get a good understanding of our individual variables, what they look like, what the average dispersion, which is our standard deviation, and the range is around our mean, our median, and our mode, we can start looking at how variables relate to each other. So Kelly mentioned looking at correlations and thinking about correlations. That's one type, bivariate analysis. We can also conduct tests of association. So this is really what funders really want to hear. Was there a statistical difference between pre and post? Was there a statistical difference between one individual group that got the intervention and the group that didn't? And so those, the basic tests there are t-test, the chi-square, and analysis of variance. I want to just draw a quick note here. When we're thinking about tests of association, the independent variable is the program. It is the thing that we manipulate to cause the change in the outcome, which is the dependent variable. And you'll read that. I just want to highlight that because I think a lot of folks just toss those terms out there sometimes and don't really define them. So it's helpful if you're reading a book at some point on some of this information, or you're looking online to answer a question. Sometimes people refer to the independent variable which causes the change. So it'd be the medication or the program or the social skills or the intervention, and the dependent variable would be the outcome that you're looking at. One way to think about bivariate analysis are through frequency tables of cross-tabbing, or so like I did with some of the student and teacher information earlier. So this would be like if we had depression scores on a scale or a depression scale, and we wanted to see if there were differences between men and women in our data set, then we can cross-tab those and we can see what the average score is for males, what the average score is for females. And then, of course, this would be the total score here. You'll get this information through a lot of approaches in Excel. So thinking about a correlation. Correlations are central to statistics. They're the basis of regression. They're the basis of everything all the way up. That's why it's important that the statement correlation does not equal causation is important, because all of the other stuff that we've talked about in terms of having good measurement instruments or good indicators of what it is that you're trying to affect, having a good sample that is representative of the population that you serve, those things are important to saying that we see a correlation here and it's meaningful. Also replicating findings over and over and over again so that we see that there's a pattern. The basic idea of the correlation, the most straightforward approach is a Pearson's R. There are a variety of correlations, but Pearson's R is the most commonly used correlation. This is sometimes called rho, after the Greek letter rho. And how you would estimate that in Excel is you can do equal and then start typing Pearson. The other way to approach it in Excel is just equal and coral. It's the same formula. And then you would select two arrays of data because you are looking at correlating two variables. So your array 1 would be one column, array 2 would be the other column of the variable you want to see if they correlate. Another note on correlations, the higher the correlation, the stronger it is. So the closer to 1. All correlations range between a -1 and a 1. You'll see some folks talk about a correlation as ranging between a 0 and a 1. They just drop that negative part. If a correlation is negative, it means it's inversely correlated. In other words, as something goes up, the other thing goes down. So education and income is a positive correlation. The more income or the more education you have, the more income you will make. So if we had just less education or fewer years of education, that would possibly, well, it wouldn't inversely correlate with it, but I'm trying to think of a good one. Anybody think of a good inverse correlational example? I can't think of one off the top of my head. But just know that if you get a negative, it doesn't mean that they're not correlated. It means that they're correlated in the opposite directions. On that worksheet example, let's see, what example was that? I think it's example 10. Yeah. So it's kind of at the back of the sheet here. Aha, I have a negative inverse or an inverse correlation with this problem. I wasn't even thinking about it. Number of outreach and the count of incidents. So this is an example of a child welfare agency that's looking at outreach, and does the number of outreach visits that they have correlate with a decrease in the number of incidents. So the more outreach visits they have, the fewer incidents that they have. So that's a negative correlation. So this example here aligns with the tab, number 10 tab on the Excel sheet that Kara will email out to everybody for your Sunday afternoon when you're interested in doing this. And so you can see up here I've calculated the average. This is an example of just using the equal choral sign and selecting each array of data. It will highlight those if you double click in it and tell you exactly the ranges. And then the other one below there is a Pearson, and it's the same number, just to demonstrate that the calculation is the same. So that's great. We got some correlations, but we really don't know whether it's statistically significant or not. We have to conduct statistical tests of mean differences between those arrays of data. So we would do that in a couple of different ways. A chi-square, and there's a chi-square worksheet that took me hours to write this out, but I actually understand it better now than I did before I did it. So this chi-square worksheet is provided in there as well. I tried to do this in Excel. It's a little complex to do it in Excel, and it doesn't make straightforward sense. So really thinking about it in the table format seemed a better way to go about it. But there's an example of, again, a child welfare agency and the number of unifications they have, and really the independent variable that we're looking at. The outcome that we're looking at is unification or not. So it's a dichotomous variable. So that is the important part, that that you would use a chi-square when you have an outcome that you're looking at that's either one thing or the other. Okay? So remember that as a tip for a chi-square. But you have multiple independent variable attributes. So for parents who use drugs, for example, or not. It will walk you through, I've given you some fake data here, and it will walk you through the process of actually coming up with the chi-square result. And at the bottom, for sake of time, I won't go over this painstakingly, but I've given you an example of how to then write a report of that, just a brief sentence on how to explain what it means. An ANOVA is if you have two or more groups and you want to look at your dependent variable and it is continuously distributed. There are many values that are possible on your dependent outcome. So testing scores, for example, have a lot of different values that individuals can fall on. Might be a good example of an outcome we're looking at. You would use an ANOVA. An analysis of variance is what ANOVA stands for. So let's see here. That is problem number 9. So we have 3 different, let's say this is a training intervention for statistics. It's Aaron Thompson's something training. What was it? I was getting a little punch drunk when I started writing this, and so I started getting silly. What did I call it? Aaron Thompson's research and stats help, A-trash, independent head pounding, and absconded tips and stats. I hate stats, or gotten flustered yet, GFI, which if you're a common texter certainly means something else. And it's looking at data from individuals that participated in 3 different interventions. So let's say you've got a different approach at your agency that looks to address a similar outcome, and you want to know what's more effective. This would be a test that you would use, potentially. If you had only 2 conditions, you can use a simple t-test. So if you have 3 or more, use an ANOVA. That's the kicker there, okay? So a t-test, when to use a t-test, let's say that you want to compare pre and post scores of within individuals. So let's say you've got 100 individuals of which you have pre-test scores on and you have post-test scores on, or follow-up information on. You would use a what's called a paired t-test to actually compare those means to see if there's a significant difference in their post-test scores. You would also use a t-test to compare independent groups. It's a different test. It's called an independent test. There's a different denominator. When we actually use data that, for the first example, if somebody's filling out the same pre and post test, you'd use a paired because there's some correlation between the pre and the post test, and we have to account for that in terms of the degrees of freedom. So that's really all you need to know about why it's different, unless you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of it. It's a little messy, but so for two groups, those are independent, and we don't have to take away those degrees of freedom when we're calculating that test. Again, there are samples on that worksheet and in the Excel sheet. Number 6 is an example of a pre and post test. So this is person 1 who took a pre-test and a post-test, person 2, so on and so forth. You would create some averages for each pre and post, and you're really looking at, are those averages in probability, are they statistically significant? If we conducted this 100 times, is that difference between pre and post likely to occur, or is it by chance? This is what this test tells you. Does that make sense? So if you conducted this 100 times, we use a p-value. Is anybody familiar with p-values in terms of reading statistics and research? What do we use? What's the cutoff? It's arbitrary, but we use it. Everybody uses it. 0.05. That tells you that 5 times out of 100, it would only be due to chance. If your value is less than that, then it's a pretty solid finding. Probability speaking, and dependent upon all of the other things that we have talked about.
Dr. Thompson?
Yes, ma'am.
So when you're looking at your pre-test and post-test up here and you're going down to each individual, the scores you put in there, so let's say your pre and post-test are all on a Likert scale. So how would you then get to the number you use there? Say you ask 5 Likert scale questions. Can you just take numbers right from the Likert scale, or you need to develop certain numbers?
How I would do it is if those Likert scale items are tapping the same idea or concept, or they're kind of centered around getting an understanding of how an individual is functioning, let's say on your biopsychosocial. You could have a total score for your biopsychosocial if you attributed values to every single thing that you're asking. I would create a total scale score and probably divide that by the number of response options that are available. So an individual would have a subscale score. Okay. So let's say you've got a 5-item Likert scale that's asking 10 items. And you add up every item that individual endorsed and divide the total by 5. So that was earlier in the slide when I kind of talked about creating raw and subscale scores. That would give you an individual with a total score on that scale. And then you would put each individual's scale scores in the column and test those scale scores. That makes sense to everybody? Okay. So t-test, I mean, I would encourage you, I could stand up here and painfully go over each one of these examples. I don't know if I'm shooting too low or if I just feel like I'm losing some of you. So I provided them with you so that you can look at them on your own time. And certainly contact me if you want to talk about it in more depth. I'm happy to discuss analytical strategies for any data that you have. But take a look at those worksheets, and Kara will mail out this Excel worksheet that actually walks through each of those problems on that example. Cole, you have a question?
I don't. Just to
okay. All right. An effect size. If you have what you think is a statistically significant difference, in other words, the probability statistic that your output returns on your Excel worksheet appears to be significant, and you want to create an effect size that communicates the strength of that significant or the strength of the relationship between the program or the intervention and the outcome, an effect size is a commonly reported statistic that will do that in a pretty succinct manner. If you have a one group, what you do is you take the pretest scores and subtract the mean of the pretest from the mean of the post, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter which direction you go. You can take the post and subtract the pre from it. That doesn't matter. Just so long as you get a difference score between those two. What matters is the interpretation of it. So this could be negative. Let's say that this number is larger and you subtract your pre. But let's say maybe you want to decrease depression scores. So that would make sense if you have a lower post-test value subtracted from a higher pre-test value. Individuals were higher in depression at start than the intervention, and then they're lower later. So if you use this approach, you're going to get a negative number. Okay? But just then divide by their pre-test standard deviation. So this is only if you have one group of individuals. If you have two groups, you have to use the standard deviation of the entire data set. And you're really looking, all you're interested at that point, when you've got two groups, are really the post-test or after intervention scores. So after they've received the intervention, are they significantly different? Dependent upon whether they were relatively similar before they received the intervention. That makes sense? So you could say, let's say we have a depression score, and we have an intervention that we've given to 30 individuals, and we look at their scores before the intervention, and we see that there's no significant difference. So you'd use just a t-test, a two-group t-test there, to say, is there a difference on those scores? If they look the same, then there's no difference. If then, after they've received the intervention, we see a significant difference between those groups, we can, with some degree of caution, relate it to the intervention itself, since that was the independent factor that was different between them, although there may be many other things. There are examples of creating an effect size statistic, again on problem number 7. How am I doing on time? Okay. So here's an example with a mock data set, again, creating the mean, calculating a t-statistic, interpreting it, and then creating an effect size out of that data set in terms of understanding what the difference is or what the strength of the relationship is between the intervention and the outcome. So reporting these results, I provided a couple of approaches within that example worksheet as well, ways to create some graphics in Excel. It's pretty straightforward. But let's bounce back to qualitative results for just a moment. When we are talking about qualitative results, I spoke about concept maps and trying to link up various concepts to each other. This would be an example of a concept map. In your narrative, you would describe all of the pieces or bits of data or discourse that you've pulled from the narrative that line up with social status. And you would use that, rearrange those narratives so that you could tell the story of why, when individuals said this, why that aligns up with social status. It's quite a laborious process, which I think is why we do put a lot of stock in quantitative approaches. I argue for mixed methods approaches that there are, like, qualitative approaches can unpack things around quantitative approaches that we don't really know, that the numbers can't tell us. So there's a lot of gray area around all of this, and so quantitative approaches can be used to understand qualitative approaches and vice versa. So I think that they're complementary. Some people think they're wildly different, and some people take very strong stances on that. In terms of reporting quantitative results, by and large, reporting the results from quantitative analysis, just the facts. It doesn't need to be fancy. Here's how many people are in my data set. I have this many males, this many females, the average age is this. And you can communicate this pretty effectively using some tables, or just describe it in a short narrative. But keep it simple and straightforward. You can use frequency tables. I'll show you an example of that in a second. If you conduct some statistical tests between groups or between pre and post data, describe which test you've used. If you have a significant finding, I think it's becoming more and more convention that we report that finding using an effect size. And that you are actually presenting the averages or the means on those scores as well as the standard deviations. So anybody with understanding about how to create or calculate an effect size can actually do that with that information. They don't actually need the data. Describing the results using tables or figures to show those changes is important. I think that sometimes you can drone on about this information in a narrative. If you can show it in a table or a figure, then great. And then I think the big important fact about why we do this information is how it drives decision making. What is it that this means? How does this mean that we're going to change what we do at Love Inc. or at Como Cares so that we can be better at achieving our goal next time? What is it that the data tells us? What is it that suggests that we need to change the process about what we're doing? So this would be an example of a frequency table. And this communicates a lot of information. So this would be for an agency that's got 4 different programs. They're offering services to a total of 688 individuals. So down on the bottom line, I provided the totals and the percentages of individuals that fit into these columns. So total, there's 688 individuals. There are 222 that the agency served that identify as European American or white. 128 individuals that identify as African American, so on and so forth. These are different treatment conditions or different programs that those individuals are enrolled in. And there's 177 enrolled in this first program, and then you can break down each total number by race, ethnicity, or by sex over here. It's a lot of information in one table. Try describing this in a narrative and it looks like muck. So think about how you can use tables like that. If you've got multiple programs, like you guys have 3 or 4 programs, even within those you've got different services. So different ways of thinking about communicating that information so that it's consumable to the person that's reading it. Mobility tables are a pretty straightforward way to analyze data. So I picked this out. Actually, this was from a study that I did that looked at stages of change. So we have a theory on stages of change from individuals, let's say they're trying to quit smoking, they're thinking about it, they're contemplating it. So we're in a state of pre-contemplation, well, maybe not really, and then contemplation, yeah, I think I might. And then action, well, I got a plan, I'm gonna put it in action, I'm gonna quit smoking, and then maintaining, I've quit smoking, and how am I gonna keep myself from sliding back? And we might have a couple of different, let's say 4 different programs that address smoking. And what a mobility table would do is we could use an assessment instrument to identify accurately that individual and what stage of change they are in. And then we can create a percentage based upon if we have X number of people in each condition, what percentage of them are on a progress state. And this allows us, then we can look at these numbers across conditions and we can say, wow, the MC condition really appears to be effective. And that's something that maybe we need to start applying to more of our clients. Or for example, wow, the CC1 condition, there were a lot of people that digressed from a maintenance state backwards. So this is a way to use your total population. This is actually the same program or same number of individuals that are included in this table here. So you're really just looking at a measure and their response on that measure and what percentage endorsed items that line up with each of these stages. And then presenting it in a percentage. There's no statistical test. It's just raw information that we're able to look at and say, okay, we've got something here. There are other charts and examples. So pie charts are great for showing proportions on one outcome. So looking at the number of mental health conditions in the city of Columbia, looking at the types of behaviors within the school system, looking at maybe diagnoses within an agency. Histogram and bar charts are useful for showing frequencies. So what number of individuals in our population selected a particular response on an item. There's some examples in that Excel sheet on conducting that and to walk through on how to create those graphics in Excel. Scatter plots or line charts are useful for more continuous information. So those would be testing information or information with more values on it. So the histogram is very useful for ordinal Likert scale type data. If you want to show where all your individuals are falling on a more continuous score, then you'd use a scatter plot and a line chart, which would be example 1, 2, 3, and 4 on that worksheet. Okay, now for the painful finish here. Be a constructive consumer of this stuff. I think that you've got to know the work in your area, right? Be aware of how researchers even talk about some of the concepts, the things that they measure. What are the strategies they use to analyze and present that information? And be cautious, always be cautious about overstepping what the data tell you. I think that I get continually tickled by researchers. I do a lot of reviewing for journals and reading how researchers even talk about their data and how they extrapolate it out to mean things. I mean, you can make some suggestions. This might potentially be something we would test in the future. Those are appropriate statements, but going beyond the data and what the data tell you, always exercise caution. Use your logic model as your guide. This is the basic framework of this entire process that we've talked about. Making sure to connect your measures to what it is that you want to look at, how you've listed that in your logic model, and then how you analyze that data. That's a discussion I think that requires ongoing honing of skills and working with that information. It's almost like a new language. And I've given you what I think are relatively straightforward strategies in Excel and the tools to do that, but I don't think that's ever enough. You can't just stop there. Working with this stuff, it requires you to have a repeated exposure to it. Good evaluation is more than just statistics, though. And I teach research and statistics, but I really try to focus students more on good design, making sure that you're collecting good information. I think that things can be presented in a pretty straightforward manner. I don't think we're going to get away from the t-tests and the probabilistic nature of statistics. It's not going to go away anytime soon, but I think that if we use good data and we talk about it in relevant ways, it doesn't have to be complex. We can present percentages. We can present mobility tables. I think that those are strategies that are more straightforward than trying to conduct statistical tests. And statistical tests have problems. And always, get help. There's a lot of information out there, some of it good, some of it bad, but certainly get help. I provided a number of resources and handouts along with the trainings. And I would say, most important, keep a positive mindset, that just because we've always done things one way doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing them another way. I want to thank everybody. I've really enjoyed this series of trainings and just getting to know everyone. I've consulted with over 25 organizations and really enjoyed just hearing about what's happening out there in the community. Keep plugging at it. It's a process and not a product. Thank you.
We want to say a special thanks to Dr. Thompson. You may not be aware of this, but since we started this process, he contributed well over 1,000 hours of his time to help us learn the logic model, to do individual consultation with agencies, working some, I think, on the Dollar Department Information Library data. It's a huge investment, and it is extraordinary. And so I want to thank you publicly and personally for all that you put into this so far. So another round of applause.